want to welcome you to today's fireside chat and Manhattan Town meeting with the Lyndon LaRouche organization. It's called Swords into Ploughshares, a Christmas message in a time of war. And there was it's inspired by a Christmas message written by Helga LaRouche, the head of the Schiller Institute, which was called Turn Swords into Ploughshares. We began with the Let My People Go. But today, the Pharaoh seems to be represented by Benjamin, not Netanyahu. So what we're going to do is to read for you this statement, because it's a Christmas message, and then we will continue from there. So Helga says, no one will be able to claim, as historians said of World War I, that we sleepwalked into World War III. The war cries today are so deafening that they threaten to awaken from the dead all of the victims of previous wars, including the First and Second World Wars. Tax money is poured into military spending of all kinds, while civilian economies collapse, infrastructure decays, and schools and hospitals are closed or fall apart. In the United States, the Pentagon's defense budget for 2024 amounts to nearly $1 trillion, while the entire European Union budget and all national budgets in Europe are slated for militarization. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius is demanding that society become war ready and has asserted that we have only 5 to 8 years before a major military confrontation with Russia. American think tanks are working feverishly on war games for a major war with China, which should, in their view, take place sooner rather than later. See the article by the Council of Foreign Relations magazine, The Big One, Preparing for a Long War with China. How did we end up on this trajectory, which can only take us to a third world war, a global nuclear war between the United States and NATO on the one side, and Russia and China on the other, and thus thermonuclear Armageddon? President Dwight Eisenhower, at the end of his mandate, warned in 1961 against the explosion of the power of the military-industrial complex, saying, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Since then, history has unfortunately shown that Eisenhower's advice was not followed, and that this unwarranted influence has spread throughout society and reduced governments to institutions doing the bidding of that military-industrial financial complex. The decisive turning point occurred when the Soviet Union dissolved. Instead of establishing a new global order of peace, as Lyndon LaRouche had envisioned with his proposal for the Eurasian land bridge, which would have integrated the European continent economically and ensured close ties between East and West, the neoconservatives opted for Anglo-American dominance over a unipolar world. The Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine of 1992 stipulated that no country or group of countries would ever be allowed to surpass the United States in political, economic, or military power. Contrary to promises made to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev at the time of German reunification, that NATO would not expand an inch eastward, NATO did just that. There were 5 NATO expansions, extending 1,000 kilometers eastward toward Russia's borders, including the installation of potentially offensive defense systems in that area, which all preceded the Russian special military operation of February 24th, 2022 in Ukraine. A new Cuban Missile Crisis at a snail's pace is upon us, so to speak. The United States and NATO countries went for political control, for the idea that all countries in the world had to adopt the Western neoliberal model, that is, regime change, color revolutions, interventionist wars in which many millions have died, military bases built around the world, war training for their foreign allies, imperial expansion of the EU and NATO, up to the point of creating a global NATO as a means to contain real and potential rivals, and sanctions aimed at effecting regime change, and finally, weaponization of the dollar. All this under the banner of the rules-based order, liberal democracy, and human rights. China, on the other hand, went for economic development and overcoming poverty for 850 million of its own citizens initially, and then increasingly for win-win cooperation with the nations of the Global South through the New Silk Road Initiative. Thanks to this cooperation, those nations were given the chance for the first time to free themselves from the poverty and underdevelopment dating back to the colonial era. Today, 150 countries of the Global South are working together with China on thousands of New Silk Road projects, building roads and high-speed railroads, ports, airports, development corridors, industrial parks, and more. In the past 10 years since China built the Belt and Road Initiative on the agenda, unbounded cultural optimism has spread among nations of the Global South, which has long since become the global majority, with the idea that they will soon become fully developed nations. They are responding to the weaponization of the dollar with de-dollarization, that is, by trading in their own currencies and eventually planning their own reserve currency, by deepening the strategic partnership between Russia and China, creating their own organizations such as the BRICS Plus, which will include 10 members as of January 1st, 2024, and dozens more very soon. Conclusion. The attempt to respond to the disintegration of the Soviet Union with the utopia of a unipolar world order held together by military power has been a monumental failure. It has led to an unprecedented strategic blowback. Therefore, the most crucial question is, can we in the West, the United States and European nations, correct our political course in time and choose cooperation with the Global South instead of confrontation? China and Russia have repeatedly emphasized that the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS countries are open to cooperation with the West. The main difficulty lies in the fact, I lost. The main difficulty lies in the fact that much of the economic capacity in the United States and a growing share of those in Europe have been taken over by the military, industrial, financial complex and are so closely entwined with the big investment firms and asset management companies of Wall Street and the City of London that a better term is the military, industrial, financial complex. Technically speaking, it would be relatively easy to retool these capacities for civilian purposes, and rather than producing bombers, fighter jets, and missiles, to produce modern, high-speed rail systems, inherently safe nuclear reactors of the fourth generation, and nuclear fusion reactors, as well as space stations for intercontinental space travel. In other words, all the industrial capacity currently used for the destruction of actual physical value, after all, what else are weapon systems good for, could serve the production of useful goods that promote the common good. Instead of tanks and ammunition, they could produce schools and hospitals and help our nations to have prosperous economies once again. Russian economist Sergei Glaziev put it in a nutshell in this message on the occasion of what would have been Lyndon LaRouche's 100th birthday, which LaRouche unfortunately did not live to see. LaRouche not only forecast with farsightedness the crisis of the neoliberal system, but also proposed solutions to overcome this crisis. The countries that rejected his solutions are in crisis today, while those that implemented his ideas are prospering, Glaziev said. Quote, in practically all the major countries in the world that today are developing successfully, above all India and China, there are partisans of LaRouche. They have used his thoughts and ideas for creating their economic miracles. It is the principles of physical economy championed by LaRouche that today underlie the Chinese economic miracle and are there in the foundations of India's economic development policy. The supporters of LaRouche in those countries exert a fruitful, very positive, and constructive influence on economic policy shaping in these leading nations of the New World economic paradigm. End quote. It is not yet too late. We need to replace the war cries for ever more weapons with a return to diplomacy and the idea that we can and must resolve all conflicts through negotiation if we are to avoid ending up in a global nuclear war and a nuclear winter, which will wipe out all memory of humanity's existence. Instead of the greed of the speculators of the military, industrial, financial complex of Wall Street and the City of London, whose high rates of profit rely on taxpayer money pouring into new wars, we must defend the existential interests of the population, the interests of farmers, small and medium-sized businesses, truck drivers, bakers, etc. Swords to plowshares. We are many, they are few. For cooperation with the nations of the global South. And that is the text of her statement, of her Christmas message. We wanted to make sure that that was heard by all of you and that you consider that as you think about the holiday. In a recent interview that was done with Oliver Stone, film director, he had a comment related to this issue of the military industrial financial complex.
We want to save the world and make it better. And at the same time, we're fighting the forces of medieval ages here. This is a desire for war. How can we spend so much money on this? This is insane, the amount of waste we create in the world. We build more and more airplanes. We renew them. We change the model. We spend another few $1 trillion building this new one. There's a new airplane out there now. And now we're redoing our whole nuclear force. Jesus Christ. You know, maybe we'll make it through. You guys are young. I won't make it to 2050, but God, I hope it goes better than this. And I count on you guys to make it better.
The interview was done by Jose Vega and Kynan Thistlethwaite. 20 years ago, the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche in New Hampshire during his final presidential campaign for the 2004 nomination, took the occasion of trying to tell a group of young people how the world had gotten to that point 20 years ago when the famous "there are weapons of mass destruction, oh wait, there aren't" Second Iraq War was fought, killing millions and launching us into this latter phase of full-scale self-destruction being carried out by the Anglosphere.
Now, what's the nature of the financial crisis? You have to look at this from the standpoint of history. The United States went into a Great Depression with much of the rest of the world between 1928 and 1933. In Europe, this resulted in the spread of fascism, as typified by Mussolini earlier, and Hitler, Franco, and so forth. In the United States, we were saved from that by the election of Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt led the United States out of the Depression over a long process and into the point that at the end of World War II, we were the most prosperous, most powerful nation in the world. Despite the mistakes that were made after the death of President Roosevelt. we continued to be the leading nation in productive power in the world through the middle of the 1960s. Then, after the missile crisis, which scared the pants off most people in 1962, after the assassination of Kennedy and the entry into the Indo-China War, we began a process of change, which is called a cultural paradigm shift, a change from a producer society, the world's leading producer society, to a post-industrial society. And this change progressed under Nixon. In 1971-72, there was a change from the monetary system which had been built up the world, built up the United States in the post-war period. We began to shift by exporting our jobs from the United States into places where the poorest people in the world would work cheaply for us. We're now in a situation where most of our industries, say in New Hampshire, you can travel up and down the Merrimack Valley and see areas that used to be centers of industry. You can see areas in the state which used to be centers of agriculture, apple growing, cattle, and so forth. They are now destitute, depending upon other kinds of income. The state was depopulated in part because young people left the state to go to other parts of the country to get jobs. Families were broken up. The population became older in the sense of demographically because young people moved away. This happened all over the country. Today, most of our jobs are exported as jobs to other countries where poor people live. Poor people in China produce a lot for us. Poor people in Mexico, a broken country, produce for us at slave labor wages. The jobs have run away from the United States. So in the process, we're now in the state where 47 states of the 50 states of the United States are now bankrupt in the sense that the state cannot raise enough money to pay for essential services at the same, except by taxing people or doing other things which will injure the tax revenue base of the state. In other words, losing cause. If you increase the taxes, you will lower the incomes of the state. Therefore, you will ruin the economy. If you try to cut more, you'll collapse the state the other way. So the states are in that position, and they need the help of the federal government to take changes which will enable these states to go through a process of recovery. That's the mission before us. Also, we have at the same time this terrible war. How did it start? There was a big change which came in the course and at the end of World War II. A change in military practice internationally for the worse. The signal of that change was the dropping of 2 nuclear weapons on the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was no military necessity for dropping those weapons. Japan was already defeated, was waiting for an approval of the terms of surrender to officially surrender. Those terms were withheld in order to let the bombs be dropped unnecessarily on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the beginning of a philosophy which was called preventive nuclear war. The author of the policy, the principal author, was Bertrand Russell, the well-known Bertrand Russell, who developed this nuclear strategy. The idea of using weapons, nuclear weapons, as weapons so terrible that nations would submit to world government and give up their sovereignty rather than submit themselves to a war. From 1945 until the Soviet Union developed a deployable thermonuclear device, the United States was operating on the basis of a long-term policy of preventive nuclear war to bring the rest of the world into subjection. When the Soviet Union developed the first deployable nuclear weapon, that had to be called off. You can't have a preventive nuclear war when the other side's got thermonuclear weapons. And soon after that, we developed thermonuclear weapons. So we went through a long period under the president, which is actually called a period of mutual and assured destruction. Shortly after the retirement of President Eisenhower, that became policy. The 1962 missile crisis, the negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union, with Bertrand Russell in the middle, we went into a system which later became known as détente after the 1972 period. So we went to a new idea of warfare. We would now create weapon systems which are so horrible that a thermonuclear war would destroy the planet, or virtually destroy it. Then you had conventional war at the other extreme. So the policy began to focus on what was called utopianism, of how to find a way to fight nuclear war without actually going to thermonuclear war. And that's what preoccupied the world from the time of the Korean War to the present time. At present, you have the Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, is committed to preventive nuclear war, a policy which he recommended in 1991-92 when he was the chief head of the defense secretary. After the events of September 11th, 2001, he brought the policy out. It had been resisted earlier by the US government. The United States is now more or less operating on the basis of the doctrine of preventive nuclear war. Now, this created another situation, which is called asymmetric warfare. That is, how do you fight war? How is war fought between the past history, the pre-1945 level, so-called conventional warfare, and general thermonuclear war? How do you find a way to fight war in that area? Well, this leads to called asymmetric warfare. We saw it clearly in Vietnam. The United States, which was foolish enough to get into the Korean War by the stupidity of President Truman, got into the Indochina War in a similar way. The United States assumed, correctly at that point, that China would not make a big fuss about a US attack on North Vietnam. So the United States proceeded to go ahead with the attack on North Vietnam, assuming that there was not going to be any serious opposition from China or other countries. But what happened is the Soviet Union intervened to assist Vietnam in planning an asymmetric defense, and we lost the war. Because one of the things that arises out of this middle area is that people say, as was done to Napoleon in 1812, come into our country. We can't defeat you at the borders, but invade our country, and you will be face to face with our general population. And our general population will attack you, man to man. And when it's man to man, super weapons don't work. This is precisely what happened in Indochina. This is because where everybody was around everybody in terms of Indochina. The same thing is now happening in Iraq, where the Iraqi population in general is in touch with the American soldier. The American soldier has no place to go. He can go into hedgehogs and try to hide, that's all. But this thing is going to come to an end. It's a failure. The problem is that there are those in Washington, chiefly in Washington, and chiefly Chinese friends, who are determined to attack Syria, to attack Iran, to attack North Korea and other countries, to keep this process of spreading war as far as possible, aiming to use nuclear weapons, so-called mini-nuclear weapons, in the process. The result of that will be, in the next president's term, unless we stop it now, will be a spread of warfare involving Russia, China, India, and many other countries. Most of the world against the United States, in the sense of being opposed to this war, or the spread of this war, as you've already seen since 2002, when this began. Under those conditions, with many submarines, with special nuclear weapons, with various other features of so-called low-intensity warfare or asymmetric warfare, the world will be tied into a war of a type that most of you could not imagine. It could be the death of civilization. Therefore, we must stop this war. It's not necessary. We don't need it. There's no problem we can't solve without it. We have to bring about a new order on this planet, which, from my knowledge of dealing with countries abroad and leaders of some of them, they're ready to accept. If the United States would change its policy to a prospect of what John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, put in the mouth of President Monroe, the objective of the United States from the beginning whose constitutional objective was to establish here a republic and to make that republic secure by fostering the development of other republics in other countries, and to enter into a community of principle among republics, among these nations. John Quincy Adams laid that policy out for the states of the Americas. We should now proceed as Roosevelt had intended to do during his time, and make that the policy for the United States toward the rest of the world. We don't need world government. We don't want a world empire. We must respect cultures, because people cannot have democratic representation unless they're able to express it in terms of their own culture. Therefore, you must have the principle that different cultures, or people who choose to form different cultures, should be sovereign in their self-government. But that we as nations, as a group of nations, so committed, should find common principles of agreement, where we can solve our problems, not through world government, not through super government, but by simply adopting common principles which we think are the common principles of humanity for this time.
So that, of course, has been what Helga Sepp LaRouche has proposed and what we've been campaigning around for over a year in the new principles for a new security and development, 10 principles, for a new security and development architecture. But we're also in the process of applying those and doing studies, if you can call them strategic studies, of the applications of this. Now, recently, we've combined sort of two elements of that. One, an analysis of this military, industrial, financial complex, which is now just sort of begun, and we're incorporating people into a task force to elaborate this study. But secondly, our actual alternative, both in terms of Southwest Asia, but the method of alternative, which comes from Lyndon LaRouche's groundbreaking work in physical economy and the people who studied with him and got to know that work. So to present both elements of this, we have Richard Freeman from Executive Intelligence Review, and he's going to give you a report, at least on where we stand and what we are trying to do, what our policy outlook is. Richard, good to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Dennis. Thank you. Along with the statement which Dennis read from Helga, she also approved a leaflet, and I'm just going to hold it up. You've probably seen it on the website, or possibly you have, but it's tough to read backwards. The military and financial complex is bloated on blood money from wars. And we're going to be getting this out across the country as far as we can, with an intensity that has not been seen in a while. And what Helga informed one of my colleagues, Dennis Small, who you've met on the show before, is that we have to get people angry. They can't just be reading this. This is not an analysis. This is not something to take into account so that when you look at the world tomorrow, you can at least maybe remember an element of this or not. This is a war. We have to dismantle this military financial complex, or else the human race will not survive. And people should be angry about this, because look what's happening. You have a permanent element set up in the country. If a war is needed to be started in any place in the world, it already has weapon systems ready to go, from which it's making a tremendous amount of money. These weapons are dropped on people who are killed, who are massacred. We're seeing this throughout the world. What's going on in Gaza is just probably the most open example of that. But we've seen this for the last 20 years. It's done in the name of the United States. It has never been approved. Almost none of these wars have been approved. They are still using the resolution, authorization for use of force, military use of force, which comes from 2001, 2002. Too cowardly to present it to the Congress so they'd actually debate it, so we would know where we stand on these questions. We have a budget that keeps funding this. The money goes into RTX, which is Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, these companies whose stocks and whose financial flows are sucked up by a group of the military industry, by the City of London and Wall Street. And these flows sustain them like any other bubble that's going on, except this bubble can lead to extinction of the human race and a nuclear winter. So this is not just a financial bubble. This is something on the existence of the human race. And on top of this, the United States must pay, because we can't afford this. So we don't build the things that we should be building all over the place and across the country. So instead, what do? We float debt. That debt has an interest on it. And now the interest on the federal debt is $1 trillion a year and growing. And part of that is functioning from the development of these Defense Department. So this is a killer apparatus. However, if we focus on this, we can accomplish three things. If we break this, we can start to raise the United States as a voice in the world. Very little is heard from the United States. Dennis Kucinich made a statement the other day, which was decent. Other people have made some decent statements. But in terms of any leading representative from the United States getting up and saying this whole policy must come to a stop, it's very rare. It also gives us the opportunity to address rebuilding the United States and the world by taking both the money flows that would go into this military financial complex and simultaneously taking the productive capabilities, which are among the most advanced in the United States, if not the most advanced, employing some of the most advanced engineering, not always well, and the purpose of it is complete waste, is complete junk. You might take the entire U.S. military budget and what is produced and go up to one of the highest, Mount Vesuvius, and drop all the products into Mount Vesuvius, and the world would be no different, because this is pure overhead waste. And yet it's killing people. So what I'd like to present here is some of the features from this leaflet. And what I'm going to say is, people, if we come to understand what this leaflet represents and some of the companies who represent, we're putting a face on these. And that's, I think, something that's very important. We're giving names to the companies. We're not just saying some, complex. We're going to name who they are. And we take this seriously to city councils, to Congress, to any place we have. And we say, this is going to be the policy of the United States. Then it will fit the United States to join with the BRICS. It will fit the United States to join with the Belt and Road Initiative. It will fit the United States to survive. If not, the world will not survive because of the implications of this policy. So let me again suggest this. This is not for those people who are looking for an interesting analysis of the world. Switch the channel. This is for getting this leaflet out every single place we can, including today on and Christmas Eve, tomorrow, and the next days after that. Just as we did in 1975 in an operation called Hylex, which I know Dennis knows a ton of things about. So if we could have the first slide, please. Okay, these are what we call the Big Six, and they have about 45% of the entire defense budget. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, and BAE Systems. These have a result of merger after merger, which has been happening over the last number of years. There used to be about 50 to 55 leading such institutions. Now, half of this is all concentrated in this Big Six. And if you look at them, and they have real capabilities for our space program, for our nuclear program, which we're going to mention in a second. But look at the percent of sales that they have that come from total revenue of the company that come from military. Lockheed Martin, 96%. BAE Systems, which is British Aerospace Systems, 96%. Northrop Grumman, 89%. You can read the rest of the figures. And these are the revenues that they're taking in from as a result of this. And as we're saying, they're addicted to blood money for wars. Next, please. Okay, now what I'd like to do is to go through a few of these companies, because we're saying that these are owned by Wall Street speculators. A few of you may be familiar with BlackRock. I think several of you probably are. But you may have never heard of State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity Management, perhaps, maybe not. These companies have bought, these are the largest stockholders. So let me mention something about the company BlackRock, because some of you have heard of BlackRock. This is it came out of what was called First Boston, that was involved in certain dirty money operations. It's headed by Larry Fink, who has connections all over the world. I want to just give you two people from this, and we're going to get, as we get more of these people's names and so forth, we're going to put out more information on them. One of the members of the board of BlackRock, which has about 10.2 trillion under management. These are called asset management companies. They're very closely related to what are called wealth management companies. The Philip Hildebrand is on the board. He's Swiss. He's a Swiss banker. He's the vice chairman of BlackRock. He was the chairman, or actually the head of the board, of the Swiss Central Bank, the Swiss National Bank, until 2010, when he had to resign over a scandal of his wife trading in certain currency arrangements. But this is one of the most important banks in the world. You have the Swiss National Bank, Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and Bank of Japan. These are the five biggest, or largely leaving out China and Russia, important ones. He was the chairman of it. He also was on the Financial Stability Board. He was a director of the Bank for International Settlements, which is sort of like the bank of all banks. It's the central bank for all central banks. And he also, at the same time, has positions in England. For example, he's on the board of the British Museum. Now you may say, well, okay, that's fine. I like going to museums. The British Museum is not a museum in any sense of the word. It's an intelligence agency. It always has been an intelligence agency since the 1800s when it was set up. And it decides on certain cultural policies. It decides on certain other policies that will be imposed on the rest of the world. And for this person to be on that, he's not Swiss. I mean, he's not British at all. Means that he's been tapped to be part of an international operation. Another person I'll just mention, so this name is Philip Hildebrand. If I had a little bit more time, I would have gotten the picture up. But we should have his picture. Is a person named Wally Adeyemo, Adeyemo. He's now the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury from BlackRock. He's the number two man in the Treasury under Janet Yellen. And we could go on and on. So these people are connected from BlackRock. But let me give you another company, just to give you one other company, to give you a feel for who we're dealing with. That's State Street. State Street is the second oldest bank, continuous bank in the United States. It was founded in 1791. It's Boston. It represents old Boston Tory money. Has represented that for any number of years now. And it operates, as you can imagine, more from the shadows, since most people could not tell you who State Street is. It also has around $9 trillion in assets. Those two banks, BlackRock and State Street, which gives them the funds which people entrust to them. Some of the money that's entrusted to them are people who just want to have buy some stocks. But most of it is done by wealthy individuals, very, very wealthy individuals, who are sucking the money out of the United States so that the United States can commit wars, which puts the world on the verge of nuclear war. That's how this operation works. And I'll just mention two people from this. Actually, I can't find their bios, but I will just tell you about them. One of them is the former chairman of Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, HSBC, which has a history of drugs. It helped set up the drug operation, running drugs from Bengal into China, addicting China to drugs, the first Opium War of 1840s, the second Opium War of the 1860s, and so forth. A second one is the former head of, well, there's about 5 or 6 banks, like Barclays Bank, Bank of Morgan Stanley, which are major banks in the world, whose directors sit on the board of this State Street Bank. So what's happened is you have this as a large sort of sucking operation that attaches funds, and you have other banks putting their members on the boards of State Street Bank so they can direct where these credit flows go and so forth, and set policy for the military, industrial, financial complex. Straight from Wall Street, straight from the City of London. Next, please. Now, this is what we can do with these resources. But what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of sense of the development of the defense budget in the United States. And again, we're touching on these elements. We're going to be doing these in depth. These are things that, though, all of these 3 tables are in the leaflet we produced, which has a very short, very powerful 2 paragraphs. This is what we want to get out, because we want to inform people how the world works and why we're a minute to midnight. But it's not a matter of throwing up your hands and saying, isn't that terrible? This is going to be our way of cutting into the process to change it. We're going to change this process. Next, please. We'll come back to this. Okay, this is the defense budget. Now, it's of the United States. It's larger than it normally is. It's compiled by the Stockholm Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, called SIPRI. And what they do is include everything in the budget that has to do with defense. So it's a little bit larger. So we've gone from about $315 billion in the year 2000 to $940 billion in the year 2023. That's slightly projected, but it's mostly what it is. So it's a tripling in only 23 years. What I'd like to give you is a sense of how this got swelled, how both the military-industrial complex and the financial forces controlling this ran a series of wars, which then swelled the budget. Look how steep it is from the year 2000 to 2010. Well, what happened? October 7th, 2001, Afghanistan is invaded illegally in order to overthrow the Taliban and allegedly to find Osama bin Laden, who was actually not that hard to find. March 20th, 2003, so that's 2001, 2003, the invasion of Iraq based on weapons of mass destruction, which of course never existed. That gave this huge upsurge to about 700 billion. Then it starts to go down some, but there were still props to this. March 19th, 2011, intervention in Libya to destroy the nation, a nation that was building water projects that were among the most advanced in the world, and to then rape and murder the president of the country, Muammar Gaddafi. Then November 2013 through February of 2014, the Euromaidan, which was run straight by British and American intelligence, including killing people on the street. To the same time, the invasion of Syria, which had actually started in 2011, but starts to intensify 2014, 2015. You'll see why I'm telling you this in a second. And then the Yemen war starts in September of 2014. Look at what happens. There's a fall in the level of the defense. And then from 2016, it starts to grow. Now, that's part of the Trump administration, and people who have an illusion that the Trump administration is going to stop defense spending are simply not facing what's going on in the world. And then you can see it really spike under the Biden administration, so that it's now gone up in the last 2.5 years. It had fallen down to the 650 level. It's now up to 940. So we've grown 300 billion in this time. Each of these illegal wars. And yet we swell the defense budget. It's one of the most dependable things you can swell. So now let's look at what we're going to do. We are going to take this defense industry and we're going to do what's called retooling. Let me just give you a slight description of this. Every factory that you go into is actually a collection of machine tools. If we could go, Jose, to the very last one, that will show you what's going on. Okay, this is a factory. It's from Wolfsburg in Germany, producing, you could probably tell by the little card hood, that's producing Volvos. Volkswagens. Look at, not so much the cars, look at the bank of machinery. And you can't see it because it goes all the way back. And this is just one cut of this whole thing. What a factory is an arrangement of machine tools. Machine tools are the tools that make other tools. If man has an idea for creative purposes and for good purposes, as well as others, the way you get it into the physical economy, to physically imprint it into nature, is you have a machine tool which then designs other machines which embody the new discoveries and the higher principles and the new technologies. So what you do in the retooling that Mrs. LaRouche and our organization is calling for is you take out the machine tools that exist. Those that are usable, you reuse them. Those that you can't, you just get rid of, and you build new machine tools. And they will embody the configuration that you want. And what you do is you give about 2 months to get a serious 2 to 3 months, because these plants would have to be seriously retooled. And then you start to produce the things which we're now going to describe. Now, I just want to mention, this was done in the United States, going the other direction. During the World War II, we retooled to make military goods. So on February 4th of 1942, the last car came off the assembly line. You could not buy a new car in the United States for 3 years. You couldn't buy new nylon stockings. You couldn't buy any of those things. We retooled. And since there had been preparation for this, it took about 3 months. And then the United States started producing some of the most advanced products, taking things like aluminum, which had been commercially not possible, using the intense energy from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the Manhattan Project to start producing cheap or electricity to make aluminum, which requires a lot of electricity, and so forth and so on. And from that point forward, the United States economy doubled. Now, you can say that the physical economy was depressed, admittedly, but doubling an economy in 3.5 years, 4.5 years actually, because it started a little bit before this, is a totally remarkable achievement. Could we do that with the United States? Absolutely. If we take this defense industrial, financial, military industrial complex and retool some of the auto industry as well as part of this process. So that's what that's what we're talking about. And workers know how to do this. Every year there's a retooling in the auto industry. Why do they retool? Because they're going to redesign the bumper, or they redesign the headlight so it now has various lights, LED lights around the main light or something like that. That's what they do. They retool for those purposes. But it takes about 2 weeks. Every worker knows this. When we were trying to do this for 2005, 2006 for Lyndon LaRouche's Economic Recovery Act and for his 2007 Homeowners and Bank Protection Act. We talked to people. I called people, and they told me, at first they were a little bit put off, like, why are you calling me? I called all the workers in different plants. I called the tech center at General Motors, and they were, why are you calling me? But once I explained what we wanted to do to start building high-speed machines, rail and so forth, they got into it. And once their imagination was started, they had all sorts of ideas. One person in a Chrysler plant in St. Louis said, we have an overhead crane. We could hold the bodies of these high-speed rails on this overhead. It wasn't just a crane, but it was a system or pulley system that took it across. And he said this would suspend it so people could work from it underneath and move it from one part of the shop to another. In other words, we have a workforce quite diminished, but still with this curiosity, this creative mind, which is critical in all workforces around the world, that would be more than happy to do this sort of work. So what are we going to do? If we can go back to the previous one. Nope, the other way, please. Okay, and one before that, Jose. Okay, so let's look at this. We priced out, I figured, we got some figures on a 120-bed hospital cost about $300 million. A hospital for 500 or more beds is about $800 million. A fully equipped school with labs and land acquisitions about $45 to $50 million. So we took a feature of the U.S. supplemental budget, which is the $106 billion to go to Ukraine, that great bastion of Nazi, freedom, and also to Israel, which is now, as people know, currently held up. We said, what happens if we just simply didn't send it? Well, split in half. 53 billion of those would produce 175 120-bed hospitals. Go into parts of Philly, go into Bed-Stuy, go into Watts, go into all places across the country. We need hospitals. We saw that when we couldn't even stop the spread of COVID, and these hospitals were overrun. We could also build 1,060 fully equipped schools. That's taking arms, swords, and putting them to plowshares. But how would we build them? Well, you can build hospitals with a lot of prefab work. Not bad stuff at all. It's modular. Prefab may be the wrong word. It's modular. In other words, you can produce modular units for the headsets over beds that have all the telemetry. You can also build this outside of hospitals. Why not do that? You can do that in factories. We can do the same thing for parts of schools. Take the F-35 fighter bomber. Now, this is a real disaster, as people are now have found out, because some of these planes, 29 of them have crashed so far. So they're not the most reliable. Well, why don't we take that at 12 billion per year times 20 years? That's 240 billion. We could replace 150,000 structurally deficient bridges in the U.S. How do we know they're structurally deficient? Because the American Society of Civil Engineers has gone around and done a survey. They are structurally deficient. Let's take missiles. Let's take some of them Raytheon missiles. Okay, 15 billion per year times 20 years, $300 billion. Repair aging urban water systems. Now, let me give you an example of this. Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson is the capital of Mississippi. They flooded a year and a half ago. The whole town. They don't have fresh water. They have trouble with their sewage. One of the reasons is because Jackson has a very large black population, and people are denying it the money. But aside from that, they don't even have a water system. This is one of the capitals of the United States. And you can go from city to city. So we could repair our aging water system. Stealth bomber, $1 billion. We can use that for the Halo main module of the lunar orbiting station for the Moon-Mars mission. What the heck do we need another stealth bomber for? Why not have this so we could advance the Moon-Mars mission? Now, the last thing I want to tell you about this, and then just a few more things, but this is to give you the insight. And I hope if people aren't taking notes, they'll go back and mark this up so that when you walk into a congressman's office and they say, well, I've heard about your stuff and it's all very general, say, oh, no, it's not just all very general. This is very specific. We have done some work on this thing, and this is what we can do. Now, what happened during all of those years that I showed you that the United States was carrying out illegal wars is that we developed something called the Overseas Contingency Operation, CO, and also the Global War on Terror. And I went back through the budgets of 2001 to 2020. This was, and it doesn't go through the normal channels of the budget. It goes outside the normal channels of the budget. So it's a permanent war slush fund. And I added it up. And it comes out to $2.05 trillion. Just that part of the budget. And this was what the United States was using to kill Afghans, blow down the buildings of people in Libya, destroy water systems and dams in Iraq. So let's take what we could do. And I'm just going to give you the figures, and then I just want to show you the pictures. Again, this is totally doable. We know how to retool. We don't know. I'm not sitting here. I'm not an engineer of that. So, but we can reach engineers who know how to do this. There's plenty of them. We consulted them in the building of these things in the first place. It's just a shame that we don't have Hal Cooper anymore, who was excellent on several of these things, but especially the high-speed rail. 500 billion. You take this 2.05 trillion. 500 billion could go to the 42,000-mile high-speed rail system in the U.S. And I'm going to go through each one of these things so that you can see them. So if we can go to the next graphics, please. Okay, and then after that, and this is Eisenhower. We'll come back to his quote. Next, please. Okay, this is a 42,000 miles of high-speed electrified rail. What does that mean? That means we would connect about 95% of all the major cities to each other and also fill in other areas across the country. It means that we would have about 26,000 miles of electrified rail, meaning high speed. So we're talking high speed. We should be thinking about 350 kilometers per hour. That would put us at about 186 miles per hour. And the other 16,000 would be magnetic levitation. Particularly the East Coast go from Florida up to Boston. On the West Coast, San Jose up to San Francisco and on to Seattle. These are the sorts of things that we would be doing with this. This is one of 5 measures which I'm going to propose, and you'll see why if we put them together. Okay, so that's the first one. That would be about 500 billion. Next one, please. Okay, a lot of you are very familiar, and I don't even have to tell you what this is, but I will. This is the North American Water and Power Alliance. We really have a crisis here. It's not talked about as much as it should be, but for example, Lake Mead behind the Hoover Dam is having real problems, and we're having problems with the water that goes from the Hoover Dam to California. So this is a project that would take the water from the Mackenzie and the Tanania and the Yukon rivers up in Alaska, which run off into the sea, into the ocean. And we would channel it down through a big trench called the Rocky Mountain Trench, which you can see identified. It would then be lifted up at the Sawtooth Lifts. We could use nuclear power for it. We would have a California extension. We would have an extension that would flow all the way into the Midwest, refill the Ogallala Aquifer in Nebraska, and join with the Plino and the Fligon in Mexico as one unified system. But for this portion would be $400 billion. Next, please. Okay, now this is going to be a U.S. corporation, a $200 billion U.S. corporation to foster fusion development. And this on the left, or my left, probably your right, it shows you it's a housing that is it's made out of gold, And what you do is you put very, very high beams, over 2 megajoules, that shoots into this chamber. So and then it reflects and then concentrates on a frozen deuterium, um, um, tritium. But both of those are isotopes of hydrogen. And what you got out of a test in July was 3.86 megajoules. That is almost double the output that you put in. And that's called ignition, when you get more output than you put in. And this was way in excess. Now and then you can see, standing in the back of this, you see a group of people, you can see the bank of lasers. There's 192 lasers that are used to do this. The problem with this is that the lasers consume about 90 to 99% of all the energy that's needed to produce the 2.05 megajoules of beam pulse that then hits the targeted frozen isotopes of deuterium and tritium. Those are old. We can't do that. They're very old. We have to replace them. We need engineers. We need scientists. The leading Lockheed Martin, out of their 115,000 employees, 60,000 are engineers. That's more than half. You get that in almost no company. Maybe you get it in some of these things like Amazon, but most of those engineers, the value is dissipated because they're just put into doing background work on how to figure out the next design to put a cute little emoji or something. I'm just making fun, but these are engineers who are very skilled, among the most skilled in the world at Lockheed Martin. Why not put them on the question so that we can solve this question of energy and get some modern banks of energy in there? This system, which is at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, it's called the National Ignition Lab, works by being able to have pulses, that is, electron beam pulses, not electron, beam pulses 4 times a year. But to make fusion commercial, you need 5 to 20 pulses per second. Well, that's another thing that has to be worked on. Why not take the scientific teams at Lockheed Martin? Why not take the scientific teams at Grumman, which were the Grumman engineers were the ones who developed, by the way, maglev back in the 1960s. They were the first people in the world. Why not take them? So you set up a corporation like the Defense Plant Corporation was during World War II. You capitalize it with $200 billion from these funds. And then they can issue usually a multiple of about 3 to 4 times whatever you're capitalized at. That's about $800 billion. If we did that with private money coming in as well, we will not be 30 years always away from fusion, and we could fulfill Lyndon LaRouche's 4th law of his 4 laws and move entirely into a new economy. And it's not just the power source. It's everything you can do with controlled beams. Next, please. Be kind of quick on these. Same thing we would do to foster fission. That's Watts Bar nuclear plant. That's in TVA territory in Tennessee Valley. And this is a folder from a Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You're looking at the core of a nuclear power plant. We had 114. We're now down to 94. And we added 2 this past year, but we're still shrinking. It's interesting that David Lilienthal, I read a book of his recently, and he was not only the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, he was the first head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And in the book, he says, he's writing this book in the 1950s, if by the year 2000, we get to 1,000 nuclear power plants in America. And it didn't seem unusual to say that. Think about 1,000 plants. Could we do it? Absolutely. Take some of this money, which is murdering people around the globe in the name of the United States, insulting every American citizen who doesn't believe in this, which is probably the majority, and take that money and put it to this useful purpose. Next, please. And this would be $200 billion for fostering space. Now, we do have a NASA budget and so forth, which is painfully, woefully small. So this would be, again, issuing such credits as needed to get many operations off the ground to make this happen. All of those would have equaled the $2.05 trillion that was spent on the overseas contingency. Now, you might say, all right, well, that's money that's already been spent. And that's a very true point. but we're going to be spending even more of this at the rate of increase of the budget, as I showed you, keeps going up the way it is, then we're going to be spending more and more and more. And I want to add one last point, because many of the people are watching, or some are, who are organizers. And they walk into an office and they get this from a congressman or a congressional staffer or whatever. Well, where are you going to get the money from? Well, if we can take money and waste it on stuff like this, we can do it the same way we got for this, which is unauthorized, because even though they keep voting up a budget every year, the wars in which this is being used to fight were never authorized. The Congress never took the vote that it should have. And we can take a lot of the things I showed you, the other missile and so forth programs, put it into this sort of thing. If we tackle these 5 things, a high-speed rail system, a North American Water and Power Alliance, the fusion, and not just laser ignition, but also magnetic confinement fusion, theta pinch fusion, and so forth. Building at least 200 more, maybe 1,000 would be great, 200 more nuclear power plants, and getting the space program of Moon Mars going so that we can actually make it work those 5 things would so transform the technological scientific principle built into the United States as a unit principle. It would so increase the potential relative population density of the United States that after 10 years of that program, you would look back and probably not be able to recognize some of the features that we would have in this country. So those are 5 huge bottlenecks that we can handle. But what else could we do with this money? And just a couple of other quickly. Next one, please, Jose. The Oasis Plan. This plan was proposed by Lyndon LaRouche in 1975, was actually being discussed in 1944, 45, and 46 under the heading of a TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, on the Jordan River. By the way, it was never done. The Jordan River is drying up. There's all sorts of consequences for not having done this. The Israelis diverted water from the Sea of Galilee, which is near the head of the Jordan River, and various other things happened. But it's part of the solution for Palestine and Israel. Those who think that you can simply sign a treaty agreement and that treaty agreement will end the war are wrong. It has to be, as Helga keeps emphasizing, paired with development. We fill up the Dead Sea. There's ways of doing it, desalinating the water, and there's all sorts of other things in the Negev Desert that you can do. There's high-speed rail systems, a whole bunch of things. Why not use some of the money that we have right now that we're shipping to Netanyahu? Why not chip money to build this policy? Next, please. And of course, we would join the whole process of the Belt and Road Initiative of the World Land Bridge. There are so many places we can put some of these funds. One that I think is absolutely essential is put it into El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, that triangle, and really develop it. And we could do this with Mexico and China, demonstrate to the world what could be done. The drug trade would be dried out, and all the people, the immigration question would be on the way to being solved. There's many places that we can do this because our defense budget is so large. Next, please. That's it. If we can go back to Eisenhower, and just to bring some of these, there's a number of things I didn't say, which I would like to, on the potential relative population density. But what this frees us to do is to return to the principles of not only Hamilton, but of Leibniz, of Denis Pepin, who built the first heat-powered machine far before Watt did in England. And those principles, which were used by Lincoln, but those principles which tap the infinite perfectibility of the mind of man to create and develop, which then takes our country into an entirely different genre, a entirely different direction. So I can't see because my picture's on the screen a little bit, this thing. But what Eisenhower is saying, this is a speech he gave 3 months after he was inaugurated as president. It's called The Chance for Peace. And he gave it before the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And he says that every warship that's launched, every rocket that's fired, these are, this money, what is it doing? It's robbing laborers. It's stealing from the genius of scientists. It's stealing from the hope of children who need these for the things to exist. And this is the man who led, as people probably know, the invasion of Normandy. But he knew what he was talking about. He said elsewhere, I hate war like only someone who's been a soldier can. And then he says, the cost of one modern bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. He already was thinking in terms of what we're calling reconversion and so forth. This is a real war, but it's the war we want. It's the war we have to wage in the United States and working with the Diane Sayer for Senate campaign. It's the war that we have to get under everyone in the United States in the next few weeks and months. We have to master what we've put together. We will be producing more information. But this embodies LaRouche's conception of how you raise the United States and mankind to another higher level, increasing the labor force, the standard of living of that labor force, the cognitive capabilities of the labor force, increasing the capital intensivity and the energy intensivity or power intensivity of the capital goods sector, increasing the infrastructure all at once. So if we take on this enemy and name the names like this fellow Hildebrand, who I mentioned from the BlackRock, and I'll get the name of the fellow who was, and we'll put it out, who was the former head of HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, who's on State Street, who are sucking in this money. And people should be angry. They should be very angry that this is being done to them. And we're watching this looting process, which is not just a looting process. It's a process of destroying the world and the United States and putting us maybe 1 second before midnight of a nuclear war. Thanks.
All right, what I want to do is to actually, first of all, just give you a characterization of what is being discussed in the chat. There are not specific questions per se, although they sort of are there. And I want to just let you know what it is. Many people are asking how they wish they could work on the different projects. One of the questions was, how can I make these projects happen? These should have happened yesterday. And other thing, more information about the financial interests. So you may just want to take that up. There is another question, but I think if you want to just respond to what I just reported to you, there's several people talking, but there's not a particular formulated question other than the one about how can I make these projects happen.
Well, I think there's 2 ways you can make this project happen. I think you can join the International Peace Coalition, and I think you can become a representative of the Sayer campaign in your state, which is what we're doing. We're happy to have classes on this. We're happy to give presentations wherever we can. We would really like people to master this, and we'll work with you so that you can give the presentations, so that you can teach yourself the economics as we go along. As for working on this project, send in your name. Anyone who wants to work on it, send in your name. We completely can use researchers and people who will look into things and discover things in this process. And let me just put a heading on this. I mentioned earlier the relative population density, and it is a concept of Lynn's that I think is the highest quality in the world. I think it's of the order of, for example, Leibniz's and Schnell's and Fermat's work on least action, or the concept of Cousa, of the coincidence of opposites. The idea is, well, let's say we would double our population in the world, and in 30 years, we have 16 billion people. Now, some people find that still frightening, and they should not. They should happily welcome it. But how do you get there? Especially since we have people who are fanatically trying to eliminate population through wars and other measures, and like the disease outbreaks in these camps near Rafah and elsewhere in Gaza, which are going to kill people. And every doctor in that area is telling you that. You would have to make a total transformation. We would have to raise the living standard, increase the amount of goods, the quality of goods, and the ability of those goods to produce a higher cognitive quality in the next level of the labor force, and yet have it cost less as a part of the total cost of production than it did before. The only way that could happen is if we're moving to the technologies that we just outlined before, and we're shutting down this defense industry. We would do the same thing for the other features, the infrastructure, which is man's artificial activity upon nature. We would do the same thing as what I said, indicated before, the capital goods. When you do that, you're not merely therefore increasing the population. You're increasing the creative force of nature represented by mankind to tackle the next task and the task after that. Therefore, an increase in potential relative population density, which has a lot to do with increasing anti-entropy, which we can discuss if someone has a question. But the point of this task is we must stop the wars. And we have to get a breakout in the United States of people who are going to take responsibilities and take, send into the chat, I'd like 100 or I'd like 200 of these leaflets. And I know places I can get them out, either on the universities and the latest farm union meeting, any meeting that you have. Because this is a fighting instrument. It's an instrument to be used to change the terms of the debate, which currently in the United States borders on just such ridiculous notions that are coming from, the official parties or so forth, and even some of the so-called opponents of war, who are good people, but who don't take any responsibility, or very little responsibility, unfortunately, for what has to happen next. And so therefore, I would say this, if you want to participate, send in something to the Schiller Institute website that will be forwarded to me. I will contact you. Other people will contact you to work on this question. But you should be really you should be angry. You should be completely angry that this is being done, and that this blood-sucking group is using war to transfer money to the City of London and to Wall Street on an unlimited basis. And it'll be a next war, and a next war, and a next war, unless we dismantle this machine. It has to be dismantled. It will occur at the same time that there's a collapse of the world financial system. And the two can be addressed at the same time with also Glass-Steagall. But this is a matter of using the period before and after Christmas, working with the Diane Sayer campaign to get some of these ideas into 10 or 15 or 100 people's hands in the next 24 hours.
All right. Since it's Christmas, everybody deserves Christmas presents, so I'm giving myself one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to respond to that, which I would normally not do, but it's Christmas time. We're going to put something up on the viewer there. Thomas Ferguson, Office of Population Affairs. This was a statement made approximately 1980. You have it there on your screen. There is a single theme behind all our work. We must reduce population levels. Either governments do it our way through nice, clean methods, or they will get the kind of mess that we have in El Salvador, or in Iran, or in Beirut. Population is a political problem. Once population is out of control, it requires authoritarian government, even fascism, to reduce it. Now, the essential thing to say is that the great secret of what is happening and about knowing what to do about what is happening is to face what is happening and has been happening. If you are 21 years old, your entire life has been spent in a United States that has been operating under the hoax of the great military threat to the United States. And the government of the United States, around which you were governed, has destroyed nation upon nation upon nation. It is not the case that that is the nature of the government of the United States. The government of the United States did not do that under Franklin Delano Roosevelt between 1932 and 1945. The government of the United States was mixed, but it was not committed to this under the Kennedy administration. There were people who were committed to it. That's why JFK got his head blown off, but he wasn't committed to it. In fact, he and his brother kept the world here as a result of their actions going around authorities, including Central Intelligence and Pentagon, to secure the survival of the planet. But the thing to know is that that idea that population is a political threat is dominant in the United States today in the population. We believe that we are responsible for this carbon footprint that's killing everybody and the whole planet, and we've got to stop this because there are too many people using too many good things. Of course, there's no problem with the idea of technological progress, and there are some people that believe that there's global warming is a man-made threat and believe in nuclear power, and nuclear power has to be used. These are ideas and areas that need to be debated. But what should not be under discussion any longer as a debate is what you are seeing happening in Gaza. You can say that's Israel if you want, but there is no way Israel could do that unless the United States and London as much as the United States, with as great as an impact, maybe even greater impact, we're making this happen. It's being generated from here, not there. People love to talk about the Zionist problem. There is a Zionist problem, and there are many Orthodox Jews that talk about it, and they describe the nature of the problem. And there is a religious component to that problem, and they describe it well. But that's not the problem of what's happening in Gaza. The problem of what's happening in Gaza is what happened on 9/11 and what then happened with the Iraq War and the aftermath of the Iraq War, which still it was a criminal action. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no declaration of war against the United States by Iraq at any time. There was simply an action of an arbitrary invasion. You know, that invasion process that we're so against with Vladimir Putin in Ukraine? Iraq is not on the border of the United States. To say we felt threatened because of 9/11, that's not why that happened. What we are living through now is a process that didn't start with 9/11, certainly. Lyndon LaRouche had described that if you saw it earlier. And so I just wanted to say that what is needed is you have to make a complete shift in the axioms of behavior of the governments of the United States and Europe, But to make that shift, the governments would have to listen to their people. Now, how come that doesn't happen? Why are you not going to be listened to by this government or the next one, by the way? It doesn't happen because the population has to transform itself so that it can be listened to and will be listened to. So that means you got to change the way you think. The whole idea of what Lyndon LaRouche did is he didn't worry about what the government was doing. He worried about what the people were doing, particularly young people were doing, and whether they would become the government. What about you becoming the government? That is, if you were in a position of power, what would you do? Do you know what to do? What's your alternative? Not what do you know that's bad that's going on. What is your solution? And then the problem is fighting for that solution, which means changing your life completely. You want to know what you have to do? You have to completely change your whole life. Because you are now in a nation that has a commitment similar to that of Nazi Germany. And your circumstance, while it may feel materially more comfortable than that, you've entered into a realm in which this nation has made Nazi-like choices, which is what Thomas Ferguson's statement, which was made 40 years ago, tells you. Now, calling people Nazis is not going to get you anywhere. I mean, you can do it if it makes you feel better. But the real issue is different. Right now, with what is happening, there are many, many people in different parts of the United States that have revolted, whether it's Jewish Voice for Peace, or it's the various people on the campuses, or other people who are having real arguments, and will be having real arguments over the Christmas dinner about where the nature of this, direction of this country is. We just invite everybody that's listening. This country needs thousands of people doing what Richard Friedman just did. And you can do this. You can do it because if you become part of the actual process we right now are doing, it doesn't matter what you know right now, but if you get involved in it, because of the combination of social media capabilities, publishing capabilities, Zoom conferences, classes, demonstrations, rallies, and organizing. In fact, we can create a circumstance right now where you could shut down the United States from the standpoint of making this issue, what was just described, how do we take back our government in the name of humanity? Because humanity needs us to do that. I think that, that's what I wanted to say, that because this is a very interesting time we're in. You're watching something happen before your eyes that Nazi Germany tried to hide. You're seeing a more explicit process with all the talk that people make about how they're more radical than their parents and other generations and what they would do and picking up a gun and all this. But the truth of the matter is, this process is just evolving, erupting, exploding, expanding before your eyes into what will ultimately become a global total war. And there is a choice before you. And you cannot say that you did not know that World War III was about to happen. You cannot say, like the people might have been able to say, who sleptwalk into World War I or World War II. That's not your situation. You're wide awake. You're just doing eyes wide shut. And so the issue is that we have to stop our fellow citizens from doing this. We can do it because the solution is there. So I just wanted to, as I say, give myself a Christmas present and say that. There are some questions you have here, so I'm going to go to those. There's a very specific question we got from Deborah, who's asking, what about the loss of jobs from artificial intelligence? What's your stand on that? What do you think of that?
Well, I just want to say one thing. I mean, what Dennis just said is excellent. And the other thing we can't leave out of the picture is we have a lot of allies around the world. The global majority is moving. This is the U.S., Britain accelerated the process, which might have taken many more years, not acted so arrogantly, weaponized the dollar, put sanctions on people, and so forth. And that's accelerated the process of decolonialization. And I really mean this. This is a break with 600 years of policy, and it's occurring right before our eyes. Those are our allies. If we did all these things, we would be fit and happy to work with China, and China would be fit and happy to work with us. They have already extended this offer to work with us on the Belt and Road when Xi Jinping extended this to Barack Obama in there you go, in 2013. The rest of the world does see what is happening, and they've just seen that this fiasco in Ukraine has proven that the super West, with all their weapon systems which they're bringing to Ukraine, and all their this and all their that, are not succeeding. And their ability to destroy countries is not succeeding. And these countries in the global majority are building, which makes them happy. And we can share in that policy. Not only can we share in it, this is our side of that policy. And we will also be giving a gift to the world that they won't wake up in the morning and wonder whether their children will be under a pile of rubble by doing this. And I mean, shut this military, industrial, financial complex down. Dismantle it, just as we will dismantle some of the firms on Wall Street. Dismantle them. Don't give them a chance again. And if people have a question as whether we can do that legal, of course we can, but we can go through it. Now, on the AI, let me just say two things about AI. First of all, yes, you don't want to see jobs lost to AI, but let me be very clear on this. What suddenly started to happen is a lot of things are now called artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has nothing to do with what actually is being done. Artificial intelligence holds that you can actually replace man and make artificially another human, something capable of a human being, which you can't. Iterative, simply repetitive programs in computers will never have the ability to create from metaphor and poetry, and music, which raises us to higher levels of ideas. Can't do it. Never will happen. Now, two aspects to AI. One, it was very funny. International Business Machine, IBM, had commercials. And 5 years ago, they were saying and showing you things. We're going to do this through advanced technology. We're going to do this through advanced technology. To be part of the shift, they're now saying we're going to do this through AI. So everything becomes AI. Much of it is just advanced technology. All right? We're not going to replace human beings through machines. And if anyone wants to have that discussion, I'd be more than happy to have that discussion. You're never going to get a hymn to intellectual beauty of Shelley. You're never going to get a grace and dignity of Schiller ever produced by a machine, because it does not have that creative capacity, which man as a soul does have. But a lot of what's being called AI is simply advanced technology. So let's clear the room on that question. I mean, it's very funny. It's to sell a point. And I think to ultimately sell people on the idea that they should accept advanced artificial intelligence for political and population control reasons, which have nothing to do with it. So they just label it AI. Now, will this displace some workers? Will advanced technology displace some workers? Well, let me just say something. Over the last 2,000 years, it has always displaced some workers. Also, over the last 2,000 years, we have always created more new jobs than we lost through being displaced through technology. it is a benefit to have a machine do more and more of the work. The days of man, there are certain things you have to do physically, but you could put a person like myself, who's 5'4", and I'm not a weightlifter, I can assure you, and I could do more with a more powerful machine than could do a whole football team trying to do the same task, and I could probably do it within a tenth of the time. And for Gottfried Leibniz, this was a measure of development. You take people, you pair them with heat-powered machines of a higher scientific design, embodying greater principles of universal principles. Same energy input, but one machine has a higher design and the other one doesn't. That's his definition of technology. So we want that. What we don't want, what we do need, is to shift a lot of the workforce to becoming engineers, to becoming scientists, to becoming more and more skilled workers, less and less workers who are not skilled. But there would be a place for people who are not skilled because they're very critical and they have minds and so forth. They're citizens. So the question is, how do you design this? And part of what we're looking at with this program that I just outlined, where you're going to be moving goods from say, New York to say, Chicago in 1.5 hours, where previously it took you 10 hours by truck. That's going to increase the entire productivity of your whole system. Don't call it AI. Just call it tremendous breakthroughs. Do we want that? Of course we want that. Do we want it to take away jobs? No. And we can create all sorts of jobs. The problem with job retraining, and I think the person who's raised the question may be aware of this, is that they give someone a job and they say, okay, you used to be a skilled auto worker, and now we're going to teach you how to do answer phone calls or something like that. The problem is they don't really give someone something that would challenge their mind. They just say to someone, okay, you lost your job, we'll try and give you something so you don't feel too depressed. That's the wrong approach, but it's the whole educational system in this country that's the wrong approach. We are not making people relive the discoveries of the greatest thinkers so that they can actually go to the hypothesis, the higher hypothesis, and to hypothesizing the unhypothesized principle. Instead, we dumb down everything we do, including in education, especially in education, what passes for education. So would we be in favor of people losing their jobs? Absolutely, positively, no. I think, though, if this is done intelligently, and this is a chance for a mass mobilization like we did in World War II, like Dennis was referencing. Under Roosevelt, we built things that we would have never built. Go to the Wilson Dam in North Carolina, it's part of the TVA. They built it at night. They put water tubes in it so they could cool the cement, because cement has to cool down, or otherwise it's going to contract at the wrong time and break. We did all sorts of things. When you push man to another dimension, he finds powers with himself and herself that have always been there but never been fully realized. And that's what we should do in retooling, in teaching people, retraining people, and so forth. We should never remove someone from a job that provides for their livelihood. But we should see how we can develop technology to our purposes, and for the most part, stop calling it AI. Call it nanotechnology. Call it things which specifically have names and scientific processes that we can look at and use. And those things, I think, are helpful on the most part. But again, we would never let someone lose a job on any of these conditions. In fact, the last point on this, what we have to do is raise the question. Look how many people are out in the streets. We have 100,000 people who died from drug overdoses. We have 50,000 who committed suicide. We have in San Jose, the average price, the median price of a home is $1.5 million. You would have to have $370,000 to be able to live as an income, to have buy a house or just pay a mortgage on that house. That's why the homelessness is huge, and the official figures are just ridiculous. Now, we've got this problem already in this country, where the standard of living measured by potential relative population density, Lyndon LaRouche's concept, and if you don't know about it, we can work with you and on classes and books to read. But measured by that, our economy has been contracting about 1.5% to 2% for the last 30 years. And we're getting further and further behind. And therefore, this program is a jolt that's needed to reverse that direction. But we would never let anyone become unemployed because of AI. We would always work, just as they do in China, to figure out a useful and important way to re-employ that person, if that were to occur.
There are some other questions, but I want to point something out because we had it earlier and people were wondering about it. Jose, if you can bring up the Atoms for Peace, that postage stamp we showed. Yeah, so you can see that around the postage stamp, this came out in 1955. To find the way by which the inventiveness of man shall be consecrated to his life. That's what it said. Some people were asking, so that's what it said. Now, the speech that Dwight Eisenhower gave on Atoms for Peace was given at the United Nations 70 years ago, December of 53. So, in other words, yeah, exactly. So that's when it was. And it's pointed out, Richard, by the way, that through that, it says, Atoms for Peace supplied equipment and information to schools, hospitals, research institutions within the U.S. and throughout the world. Then the first nuclear reactors in Israel and Islamabad in Pakistan were built under the program by American Machine and Foundry, a company more commonly known as a major manufacturer of bowling equipment. Could you just say something about how you have a bowling equipment company at the forefront of nuclear power plant production?
Sure. And look the other way around. During World War II, when we were trying to convert for war production, people may be familiar with Baldwin pianos. They don't come in the grand level like Steinway's or Beckendorf's, but they're kind of stand-up pianos. They converted and they were producing gliders. That's what they did for World War II instead of producing pianos. Reverse it. Yes. Look, let me say one thing about Eisenhower, because I think he's gotten, there's problems with Eisenhower, significant problems. But there was also some very, very good things. Atoms for Peace. Precisely. He lived through the war. He saw what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And people should know that of the top 14 generals and admirals in the United States, 12 were against dropping the bomb. The person who pushed this through was Churchill, because Churchill had a vote on dropping the bomb, which was co-equal with the United States because of the 1943 Quebec Conference, where for giving some of the technology that Britain had, whatever it was worth, to the United States to work on this, they gave Churchill that thing. And Churchill said, even after the bomb was dropped, I never regretted this thing. And he was perhaps the biggest pusher for that. I don't mean to take the United States off the hook. That the moral and what Kynan has been saying about the film 815 is absolutely essential and must continue to be said. Americans must realize what we did and what we're doing. It's the same thing. Look at Hiroshima. If people have seen that 815 film, but look at what's happening in Gaza. Do you think there's much difference? They just don't have nuclear burns. But the thing I would say is he did the Atoms for Peace, which was, as you said, and he gave a speech because he knew that the atom had a tremendous potentiality. And he developed this thing starting in 1953. He then worked with actually Hubert Humphrey, a Democrat, to develop Food for Peace. So you had Atoms for Peace and you had Food for Peace, which was to provide food for the whole world. Eisenhower, still reflecting a certain Republican tradition, which he picked up through his work at West Point and also through the work of George Marshall, who gave Eisenhower his last 2 stars so he could get Eisenhower into conferences with the British where the United States wouldn't be backed down because uh, Eisenhower was junior an officer. So Marshall pushed him forward. But Eisenhower stood up when the British and the French and the Israelis invaded Suez. Because why? Because Nasser, who was a very good leader, and he said, we're going to take the canal. It's Egyptian territory, the Suez Canal. That's what I'm talking about. And we will make it Egyptian. And we're also going to shift to build our Aswan Dam if the United States won't build it. And the British went nuts. And by the way, you know where they landed their forces? In Gaza. That's where the British did when they invaded. People may not know the history, but the British and the Israelis and the French invaded because Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. And what did Eisenhower do? He gave a model for what Americans can do. People say, well, Biden can't do this, Biden couldn't do that. Well, here's 3 countries, and Eisenhower went to the UN. He also gave speeches, and he backed them down. And they had to leave after their invasion. That's what an American president who is really committed can do. So to answer your question, yes, bowling ball companies can do it. Look, Americans used to, in the 50s and 60s, go off to the garage on a Sunday and spend 1 or 2 hours either tooling with their car or building something. They like to build things. There's a tendency among people, not just Americans, they like to build things if you give them the proper chance. So anyone could figure out how a bowling company, I don't know how to do it. I'm not going to say I didn't do that, but it can be done. Anything can be retooled. You just apply your mind to it. That scene in Apollo 13 where they had to come up with an alternative air system, and they did. I assume most of it was based on the truth. If the key thing is you have to have a passion of love for mankind. You have to want to lift up mankind as your mission in life. And the more you do it and the more good you do, the happy you are. And that strengthens that power. It's a power that grows by being in use. And for this mobilization to work, as Dennis indicated, that passion has to be put into operation. We have to mobilize that passion to say, we are tired of always complaining about these things. Let's put an end to their power. Now you can say, well, they've got weapons and they've got multi-billion-dollar contracts. Yes, so did a lot of other people. And then 5 years later, they're bankrupt. And some of these firms, I didn't want to go into them, but some of these firms like State Street, which is very important, 91.5% of all their money deposits are uninsured. And if you remember what happened to Valley Bank in California earlier this year, they face that sort of possibility. You can't just step out of a financial crisis and exempt yourself. So you have to have this passion. And therefore, whoever figured out how to build those dams, which is wonderful, using a bowling ball company, I take my hat off to them.
We have a specific kind of question from Steve. He asked this: in case there was going to be a large regional war, huge weapon depots had been previously buried in Israel. And he's asking, have they, and that could be any they, been getting into these depots already? Are these, I think what his point is, are these weapons being used or not? Do we know anything about it?
I don't. Let me raise one interesting question, which Helga has brought up a few times. If you want to center this as strictly Israel is this and Israel is that, and we know what Israel is doing. We're seeing it. We're denouncing it. But Helga raised the question several times. Isn't it interesting that at the point at which the Ukraine myth that there was even an army halfway or 1/15 of the way capable of fighting the Russians, which there isn't, as that myth starts to get pierced, that suddenly the Israelis don't pay any intelligence, or apparently don't pay any intelligence, to what they were being warned about from all sorts of countries around the world about perhaps attack by Hamas. And I find that the statement, you could say, well, maybe they shifted some of their defense forces to the West Bank, but their intelligence, this is a garrison state, it's a garrison intelligence state. They couldn't have missed the preparations that were going on. So isn't it interesting that suddenly, just at the point to kindle this nuclear war threat to be held around the whole world, that suddenly the Israelis missed some intelligence signals? Or is that really the case? Do we know if that's the case? And I would say we don't. We don't. And I wouldn't be so confident that they didn't know. After all, as Dennis Speed has made the point several times, Netanyahu helped finance Hamas, and I'm sure they penetrated Hamas. The Israeli intelligence would not simply just let these things happen and be observing them. So I don't know whether they've gone into bunkers underground or whatever they're doing. They aren't destroying the Israeli state. Let's be very clear. The killing that's going on is almost unprecedented since World War II. This level of just outright massacres. It's sort of the stuff that you would expect from the Romans, many, many centuries ago. But the Israelis are killing themselves. They are just exposing what happens if you put yourself into a Spartan state where your only motivation is vendetta, vengeance. When you get to that level, you can't think. And they may not see it because they're so revved up on that mode of thinking. But the rest of the world is seeing more than it really is. So my answer to you is I don't know about it. I'll raise this with people, but I don't know that whether they are or not going underground. But I do think it's very worthwhile considering, is the event that's going on in Israel right now perhaps more related to international forces and the context in which those international forces are watching a financial system collapse full scale, full speed ahead, and need another incident, rather than simply the eternal fight between Israel and Palestinians, which also factor into this. But could there have been an overriding larger question?
Well, one thing that certainly has happened is that people have been stirred up. One person writes in, I volunteer and propose we begin to organize ourselves and others to study today's program and then perhaps launch another series of Washington, D.C. meetings and confrontation with so-called representatives, as we have done before. I also point out that I think a lot of these representatives are now in their districts, or at least they're at home, so they may be more reachable from that standpoint. And then again, for anybody that wants to be involved in the work that we're doing, because the idea is this is an ongoing project to take a good look at what this military industrial financial complex is. Let me also just note that a lot of that complex is, of course, in Silicon Valley, and it's of a cyber nature. And in fact, one might argue that Silicon Valley is that complex. So there may be a lot of things that we don't know, we don't realize that we don't know, that are much more intimately connected, as, for example, is a large section of the so-called entertainment industry, and particularly the movie industry, which has contracts with the Pentagon clearing the scripts of literally hundreds of movies each year. So there are maybe many of you who have insight into this, which might not be available or accessible for others who are working on other elements of this picture. So anybody that would like to be involved, just get in touch with us, by means of the website or the organizers with whom you speak. Okay, Richard, we're pretty much up on the on our time here. So you have anything that you haven't had a chance to say you want to allude to, or anything just in terms of response that you'd like to have at this point?
Yeah, just two things. If people are going to write in, Dennis, great. there's all sorts of work we have to do. I mean, I'll just say Cade Levinson proposed that we take in Scranton, what used to be something producing something useful is now making HIMARS, and that we repurpose it to producing the various carbon, high strength carbon fibers, because they're very rich in anthracite coal there. There's all sorts of thinking to be done. So please join us. This is a useful task, but people should be excited and they should be doing it. Do not sit home tonight and tomorrow and say, well, I'm glad someone else on the other end of this who watched this on Saturday went out and did something. No, you should do it. The world depends upon you. And when you do it, your mind becomes smarter. You don't learn passively ingesting something in some stupid university classroom. You use it because your mind is saying, I must do something worthwhile for the mankind. And suddenly you discover powers that your mind has by doing the good. So, and the world is there. The BRICS could be BRICS 30 or 40 by the middle part of this year. That will totally shift the balance if we do our part on our end of the work we have to do.
Okay, I think Jose, who is he can't be on. I think he has something he'd like to say. I think he can't be seen. But go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's coming.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry I can't be seen right now. It's a little short notice and it's a little loud in my house too. Christmas festivities and stuff, but I do just want to tell everybody that they should take advantage of the fact that they aren't going to be rained down this Christmas by some kind of hell drone missile strike, and use the fact that you will probably wake up tomorrow to fight for those who will have to wonder tonight if they will even make it to the 25th or not. I think now is the time to really think about what am I not doing, what kind of interventions can I be making, and to what extent can I actually do something, and then can I do more than that. Push yourself, because that's the gift you have, to push yourself. So, I guess that's really all I would want to say right now. Just act.
Terrific.
And act not for yourself, but for humanity. And not just for the people now, but for the people who will be born 50 years from now. Right now you are creating a bunch of Hamas soldiers 20 years from now. Can you create a bunch of scientists who will exist 20 years from now instead of Hamas soldiers? So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's good advice, and I want to thank you, Richard, for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for both the questions and the discussion. And what we'll do is we are going to conclude today by trying to address this matter of how you make a shift, an internal shift. What we're going to do, you're going to be seeing 3 musical selections. The first will be performed by John Segerson from Handel's Messiah, and it is the Every Valley Shall Be Exalted. And the second will be with Sylvia Lee and Bill Warfield. Going to tell us a little bit about the Christmas story and why it was important, and how Christ as a child changed the axioms of the teachers. And and in that image, I'd like people just to think about, if you were watching the show at the beginning, what you saw Lyndon LaRouche doing with that group of people, about approximately 50 years younger than he, 60 years younger even, in 2003. Because that's exactly the power that we all have, should we choose to use it.
Voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight exalted, shall be and every mountain and hill made low. The crooked straight and the rough places plain. The crooked straight and the rough places and every mountain and hill made low. The crooked straight, and the rough places plain, and the rough places plain, and the rough places plain. The crooked straight and the rough places plain.
Sister Mary had but one child, born in Bethlehem, and every time the baby cried, she'd rock him in the weary land. She'd rock him in the weary land. Three wise men to Jerusalem came. They traveled very far. They said, where is he born, a king of the Jews? For we have seen his star. King Herod's heart was heavy. He marveled, but his face was grim. He said, tell me where the child may be found. I'll go and worship him. I'll go and worship him. Sister Mary had but one child, born in Bethlehem, and every time the baby cried, rock him in the weary land. She'd rock him in a weary land. An angel appeared unto Joseph and gave him this command. Arise, ye take your wife and child, go flee into Egypt's land. For yonder comes over Herod, a wicked man and bold. He's slaying all of the children from 6 to 8 days old. From 6 to 8 days old. Sister Mary had but one child, born in Bethlehem, and every time the baby cried, she'd rock him in a weary land. She'd rock him in a weary land. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. This little boy had to remember that he was born the 25th of December. Lawyers and doctors were amazed and had to give the little boy the praise. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. Lawyers and doctors stood and wondered as though they had been struck by thunder. Then they decided while they wondered that all mankind must come under. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. The last time the little boy was seen, he was standing on Mount Olivet Green when he dispersed all the crowd. He entered up into a cloud. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old